In the year 53 before Christ, a Roman general knelt in the dust of a desert he was never supposed to enter, and waited for the end. His name was Crassus. He was, by some measures, the richest man in the history of Rome, and he had marched east, chasing one more glory, across a river that everyone had warned him to respect. He would not be marching back. Almost none of his men would. What destroyed them wasn't a bigger army. It was an idea Rome could not answer, and that idea, born on the far bank of a single river, is the buried key to one of the most misread prophecies in the entire Bible. A verse that, in our own lifetime, the modern world quietly handed to China. But to see why that's wrong, and to see what the words actually meant, you have to stand where Crassus stood, at the edge of the world, looking east. The river was the Euphrates. For Rome, it wasn't just water, it was the line. The place where the empire that genuinely believed it would rule forever, simply stopped. West of the Euphrates was order, roads, law, the known. East of it was something Rome never tamed in all its centuries, and the people who lived on that far bank had a way of war that turned Roman strength into a death sentence. They were the Parthians. Picture the battlefield at a place called Carrhae. Crassus brings the legions, heavy infantry, the most disciplined killing machine the ancient world ever built. Shields locked, shoulder to shoulder, unstoppable, against an enemy that comes close enough to be stabbed. The Parthians refused to come close. They fought on horseback, mounted archers, circling, never engaging, raining arrows from a distance the legionaries could not cross. And when the Romans charged, the riders simply withdrew and twisted backward in the saddle at a full gallop to fire over their own horses' tails. That maneuver was so devastating, so iconic, that it gave us a phrase we still use without knowing its origin. A final blow delivered while retreating, a parting shot, the Parthian shot. The legions had no answer. They couldn't close the gap. They couldn't outrun horses. They stood in the heat, in tightening circles, as the arrows came and came and came, and the supply of arrows never seemed to end, because the Parthians had baggage camels loaded with more. By the time it was over, tens of thousands of Romans were dead or enslaved. Crassus was killed in the chaos that followed, and the legend that grew around his death tells you everything about how the Romans understood their enemy. The story, whether or not it literally happened, was that the Parthians poured molten gold down the dead general's throat. A punishment fitted to the man. You wanted the riches of the East, Roman? Here, drink them. That image burned itself into the Roman imagination. The East was where greed went to die, where the unconquerable army discovered it could be unmade. And there was a second wound, deeper than the bodies in the sand. The Parthians took the eagles. The legionary standards, the golden eagles each legion carried, were the soul of that legion. To lose your eagle was the ultimate disgrace, and at Carrhae, the eagles of Rome were carried east, across the river, into enemy hands. For decades, getting them back was a national obsession. When the Emperor Augustus finally negotiated their return, he treated it like a military triumph, even though not a single battle had been fought to win them. That's how raw the memory stayed. So hold this picture in your mind because everything depends on it. To a person living in the Roman East in the 1st century, the exact world in which the book of Revelation was written, the phrase, "the kings from the East," was not abstract. It was not a riddle about the distant future. It was the stuff of nightmares they had already lived. It meant the horsemen across the river. It meant the one frontier that could break Rome. Now, let's jump forward almost 2,000 years and watch that ancient dread get pinned to a brand new map. The verse in question is short. Revelation chapter 16, verse 12. The 6th angel pours out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and the water dries up to prepare the way for the kings from the east. A drying river, an eastern army with a clear road west. 6 verses later, the armies gather at a place the text calls Armageddon. For most of Christian history, readers connected those kings from the east to the only eastern menace that mattered: the empires beyond the Euphrates, Parthia, and later the Turks. Real powers on the real frontier, the verse names. Then came 9170, and a single book changed how tens of millions of people read that line. The book was called The Late Great Planet Earth, written by an American named Hal Lindsey, and calling it popular undersells it. It was, according to the New York Times, the best-selling nonfiction book of the entire decade. Tens of millions of copies, translated into dozens of languages, eventually a film narrated of all people by Orson Welles. Lindsay's pitch was electric. He said the Bible was, his words, more up-to-date than tomorrow's newspaper. And he read the prophecies of Revelation like a battle map of the coming Third World War. On that map, the kings from the East got a name. Lindsay looked at the verse about the drying Euphrates, and he looked at the world of the Cold War, and he saw one obvious candidate, a vast rising communist power in Asia. He called it, in the language of the era, Red China. The kings of the East were no longer the Parthians. They were Beijing, an Asian horde marching west. And then he did something clever and something that does not hold up. He reached for a completely different verse, Revelation chapter 9, which mentions an army numbering 200 million. And he welded the two together. The 200 million from chapter 9 became the size of the Eastern Army from chapter 16. Why 200 million? Because in those years, China boasted it could field a militia of roughly that size. The number seemed to match. So the match became the proof. But sit with what just happened there, because it's the whole trick in miniature. The identification didn't come from the text, it came from the headline. China had a big population. China was communist. China was feared. So the verse was bent to fit China. The newspaper picked the suspect, and then the Bible was made to agree. And the seam where the two verses were glued together doesn't hold. Go read Revelation chapter 9 for yourself. The 200 million force there is not a human army at all. The text describes mounted creatures with heads like lions, breathing fire and smoke and sulfur, with tails like serpents. It is a vision of a supernatural demonic horde, not soldiers from any nation on a map. Even many who want to believe the China reading get stuck right here. You cannot quietly turn a fire-breathing demonic swarm into the People's Liberation Army and pretend the text supports you. So the modern reading rests on a number borrowed from the wrong vision, attached to a country the writer of Revelation had never heard of, on the far side of a world he didn't know existed. That's not interpretation. That's a Cold War anxiety wearing a Bible verse like a costume. But if the kings of the East were never China, then who were they? And here the trail gets genuinely interesting, because the answer is older than Revelation itself. Start with the geography, plainly. When the writer says, the great river Euphrates, he is naming the most loaded border in his world. For the Hebrew scriptures, the Euphrates marked the very edge of the land promised to Abraham. For the Roman Empire, as we've seen, it marked the edge of safety. It was the boundary across which destroyers had always come. The Assyrians crossed it to crush the northern kingdom. The Babylonians crossed it to burn Jerusalem and drag its people into exile. So when a first-century writer says a river dries up and lets armies cross from the east, he is pulling a lever that's been wired into the religious memory of his people for centuries. A dried river at that frontier meant one thing: the wall is down. The thing you feared most is coming across. And there was one specific event, one night in history, that gave this image its deepest charge. Travel back further still to the year 539 before Christ, to the city of Babylon, the greatest, proudest, most fortified city on earth. Babylon sat astride a river, protected by walls so massive the ancients counted them among the wonders of the world. Nobody took Babylon. It was, by reputation, impossible. And then, in a single night, it fell. The conqueror was a Persian king named Cyrus, and according to the ancient historians, the way he did it was almost unthinkable in its boldness. He didn't batter the walls, he attacked the water. Cyrus's engineers diverted the river that ran through the city, dropping its level until the channel beneath the great walls became shallow enough for his soldiers to wade through under the defenses into the heart of Babylon. The river that protected the unconquerable city was turned off, and through the drained channel, the army from the east walked in. The Hebrew scriptures remembered that night with awe. In one famous account, the Babylonian king is feasting, drunk on his own security, when writing appears on the wall. And that very night, the kingdom is taken and given to the conquerors from the east, weighed in the balance and found wanting. Now look at what the prophets did with Cyrus. The book of Isaiah speaks of one from the east, roused up, summoned, called by name, a conqueror whom God dries the rivers to make way for. Isaiah even calls this eastern king God's anointed, his shepherd, the instrument that shatters proud Babylon and sets the exiles free. Read that again with Revelation open beside it. A drying river, a conqueror from the east, a doomed city called Babylon. The pattern is identical, because Revelation isn't inventing the image, it's quoting it. This is the layer almost no prophecy chart ever shows you. The writer of Revelation was not gazing into the 20th century and seeing tanks roll out of Beijing. He was reaching back into Isaiah, into the fall of historical Babylon, into Cyrus and the drained river, and reusing a sacred, ready-made template that his audience already knew in their bones. Kings from the East wasn't a prediction waiting for a country to fill it. It was a quotation, a deliberate echo of the most famous fall of the superpower story in the Hebrew Bible. And that raises the question that detonates the entire modern reading. If Revelation is replaying the fall of Babylon, then in Revelation, who is Babylon? Because in Isaiah, Babylon was the literal city by the river. But Revelation is writing centuries later to a different audience, under a different empire. So when Revelation says Babylon over and over, Babylon the great, fallen, fallen, who is the writer actually talking about? He tells you. He just tells you in code. He describes Babylon as a city seated on 7 hills. He describes her as the great power drunk on the blood of the faithful, the city that rules over the kings of the earth. There was exactly one city in that world built on 7 famous hills that ruled the known earth, and that was killing Christians when Revelation was written. It wasn't a city in the East at all. It was Rome. This is the hinge the whole video turns on, so let it land slowly. In Revelation, Babylon is not Iraq. It is not some future Eastern menace. It is not China. Babylon is a disguised name for Rome, the very empire that held the power of life and death over the book's first readers. The writer couldn't say Rome out loud. Naming the empire as the doomed city would have been a death sentence, so he used the oldest code his readers knew. He called Rome by the name of the last great empire that thought itself eternal and fell in a single night to an army from the east. Now, the verse reorganizes itself completely. The drying Euphrates was never a road being cleared for China to invade somebody else. In the logic of the prophecy, it's the defense of the proud superpower being stripped away, exactly as Cyrus stripped away Babylon's river. The kings from the east aren't the villains of the story. They are the instrument of judgment against the empire that believed it was untouchable. They're playing the role Cyrus played, and the empire in the crosshairs is the one reading the book. Feel how thoroughly that inverts the popular version. For 2,000 years, powerful readers assumed the verse was about a threat coming for them from far away, the frightening foreigner, the horde on the horizon. But the template the writer was using points the other direction. The river dries up not to doom a distant nation, but to expose the arrogance of the empire at the center, the one so sure of its walls that it never imagined it could be Babylon. And yet the misreading never dies. It just keeps changing costumes. Watch the Eastern menace get recast, generation after generation. In the early centuries, it was the Parthians, then the Persians, who actually did break Rome's frontier. In the Middle Ages, Christian writers looked east and saw the Turks pouring toward Europe, and they read those same armies straight into this verse. The face on the far bank changed. The verse stayed the same. The fear did all the work. Then the modern world arrived, and the fear found a faster engine. In the 19th and 20th centuries, a current of anxiety swept the West that historians bluntly call the Yellow Peril, a dread of a rising populous Asia overwhelming European civilization. It was racial, it was geopolitical, and it was hunting for scripture to confirm it. The drying Euphrates and the kings of the East were perfect raw material. The verse didn't create the fear, The fear adopted the verse. By Hal Lindsey's day, the candidate had hardened into communist China, vast, alien, armed, and east. And once a generation of readers was primed to see China in that verse, they started seeing confirmation everywhere, including, remarkably, in the river itself. Because in the 20th century, something real began happening to the actual Euphrates. Upstream, enormous dams went up, gigantic projects that, when filling their reservoirs, choked the river's flow downstream to a fraction of what it had been. At moments, stretches of the great river ran low, even ran dry, and prophecy watchers saw the headlines and felt their pulse quicken. The Euphrates is drying, just like the verse said. The clock is ticking. The kings of the east are next. But look at what that reaction reveals. A river was dammed for irrigation and electricity, an ordinary act of modern engineering happening to dozens of rivers around the world. And a slice of readers instantly converted it into a countdown to apocalypse, with China cast as the approaching horde. That is not the text speaking. That is the same machine that has been running since Crassus drank his gold, taking whatever the powerful currently fear and stamping it onto an ancient verse about a river. And here is the quiet irony underneath all of it. The people most certain that the prophecy was about some other nation, the foreign threat, the eastern horde, were reading from inside the very kind of empire the prophecy was actually built to humble. A confident, dominant superpower, sure of its permanence, scanning the horizon for the barbarians, is not the hero standing safe behind the verse. In the original logic, that is precisely the city the river is drying for. So strip away 2,000 years of borrowed costumes, and the prophecy is not a satellite photo of a future Asian army. It is a much older, much harder message, and it's pointed in a direction almost nobody wants to look. Every empire that has ever read these words assumed it was the one in danger from the east. Rome assumed it. Christendom assumed it. The modern West assumed it. Each one searched the far bank of the river for the army that would come to end it, and each one missed the same thing. The verse was never really about who is coming across the river. It was about the empire standing on the near side, the one so convinced of its own walls, its own wealth, its own forever, that it could not conceive of being weighed and found wanting. Cyrus did not come because Babylon was weak. He came because Babylon was proud. The river didn't dry up to start an invasion. It dried up to prove that the unconquerable city never was. That is the question the prophecy actually asks, not who is the eastern enemy we should fear. That question is a distraction the powerful have used for 20 centuries to point the danger anywhere but home. The real question, the one buried under Crassus and Cyrus and Lindsey and every dam on the Euphrates, is quieter and far more uncomfortable. It asks every empire, every superpower, every civilization sure of its own permanence. What makes you so certain you are not Babylon? The horsemen on the far bank were always just the instrument. The mirror was always aimed at the throne, and the river, the great river, the line that the mightiest empire on earth believed would protect it forever, has only ever carried one message for the powerful who read its name. Walls fail, rivers fall, and no empire that ever called itself eternal was right.